Picture this. You're sitting in a laboratory chair, right? You're wired up to this massive EEG machine.
Just completely covered in sensors.
Exactly. And a team of cognitive neuroscientists is sitting there monitoring the real-time electrical activity in your brain.
Sounds incredibly stressful, honestly.
Oh, totally. But you're working on this seemingly impossible logic puzzle, just staring at the screen, and you are completely stuck.
Right, hitting a total wall.
Yeah. And then, out of nowhere, you feel it. That beautiful sudden flash of insight, the answer just kind of arrives.
The classic eureka moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
You hit the buzzer, you shout, "I've got it!" And you basically feel like an absolute genius.
Naturally.
But here is the really unsettling truth. It's hiding in the data from that EEG machine. Your brain actually solved the puzzle before you did.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. Exactly 300 milliseconds before you consciously felt that flash of insight, before you ever thought to hit that buzzer. The physical organ inside your skull produced a massive spike of high-frequency energy.
Right, the biological machinery already had the answer.
Yeah, a full third of a second before it even bothered to inform your conscious mind.
I mean, it is just one of the most humbling findings in modern neuroscience, really.
Humbling is definitely the word for it.
Because, we walk around all day feeling like our conscious waking mind, the I that is speaking and making decisions, is the CEO of the whole operation.
Like we're the ones calling all the shots.
Exactly. But when you look at that 300 millisecond delay, it forces this radical perspective shift. It implies that consciousness isn't actually the chef in the kitchen cooking up the brilliant ideas.
Oh, I love that. So what is it?
Consciousness is just the waiter bringing the meal to the table.
Wow, just the waiter.
Yeah. The actual heavy lifting, the combinatorial processing that produces our best ideas, it's all happening in this dark, completely unlit basement of the mind that we don't even have direct access to.
That is so fascinating. So, welcome to the deep dive. To you, the learner listening right now, consider this a complete teardown of everything you've ever been taught about where your best ideas come from.
We are fully dismantling the myth of the eureka moment today.
Because culturally, we are obsessed with that lightning bolt narrative, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. The apple falling on Newton's head.
Right. The cinematic camera pushes in, the music swells, and the genius just receives a literal download from the universe.
It's a fantastic story.
It really is. But when you look at the cognitive psychology, the neurobiology, and just historical case studies of how innovation actually happens, that narrative isn't just slightly inaccurate.
No, it's entirely false.
Completely false. It's actually the end result of a long, invisible, and highly structured cognitive architecture.
And, it's a deeply comforting myth, which is exactly why it persists.
Comforting how?
Well, if brilliance is just this random external force waiting to strike from the heavens, it completely absolves us of the responsibility to cultivate it.
Oh, I see. Like, oh, well, the muse just didn't visit me today.
Exactly. It lets us off the hook. But the moment you strip away all that romanticism and look at the actual engine of insight, you realize that what feels like magic is actually a mechanical, biological process.
Just meat and electricity doing their thing.
Pretty much. It's a process of pattern recognition, semantic association, and neuroplasticity.
So the phenomenological experience, like the feeling of the sudden aha in the shower, that part is real.
Oh, very real. It just doesn't come from nowhere. It's merely the final conscious echo of a massive chain of subconscious events.
Okay, so before we break down that chain of events, we really need to establish some guardrails here.
Good idea. Definitions matter.
Yeah, because when I was reviewing the research for this, I kept hitting this philosophical wall.
Yeah.
Like, how does the scientific community even study something as notoriously slippery as creativity?
It's definitely not like measuring blood pressure.
Right. Or the boiling point of water. How do you take a concept that applies to, a Renaissance oil painting and also a new corporate tax loophole and define it objectively enough to put it under an fMRI machine?
Well, that was actually the foundational crisis of the field for decades. Psychologists realized they couldn't just rely on subjective judgments of what is artistic.
Because art is totally subjective.
Exactly. They needed a rigid empirical baseline. And the consensus that eventually emerged, which we actually still use today, requires a product or an idea to meet two simultaneous, non-negotiable criteria to be classified as creative.
Okay, lay them on me. What's the first one?
The first criterion is that it must be genuinely novel.
Meaning it can't just be an imitation. Like, if I perfectly forge a Picasso, that takes immense skill, but it possesses zero novelty.
Spot on. It cannot merely be a regurgitation of existing elements without some kind of transformative leap.
It has to introduce an unprecedented variable.
Right, a new perspective or a new combination to the context. But here's the thing, novelty is actually the easy part.
Wait, really? Novelty is easy.
Yeah. I mean, if I decide to design a new type of umbrella made entirely out of soluble cotton candy that is incredibly novel.
Nobody's ever done that.
Exactly. But why hasn't anyone done it?
Because it would immediately melt the second it started raining. You'd just be covered in sticky sugar water.
Right. It fails the second criterion catastrophically.
Wow. Okay. So what is the second criterion?
The idea must be appropriate or useful. Pure novelty without utility is just eccentricity.
It's just a random mutation that doesn't survive.
Exactly. To be considered a creative act, the novel generation must actually solve the constraints of the problem at hand.
You know what I find so empowering about this two-part definition, novel and useful, is how it radically democratizes the entire concept of creativity.
It really does. It levels the playing field.
It completely rips it out of the exclusive domain of, like, the tortured artist in Paris or the tech billionaire in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
Because by this scientific standard, a mechanic figuring out a way to use a modified wrench to reach a stripped bolt that the manufacturer didn't account for, that's engaging in the exact same cognitive process as a poet finding the perfect metaphor for grief.
Yes. Or even a parent who invents some highly specific, bizarre game on the fly just to get a stubborn toddler to put on their shoes.
Oh man, every parent listening knows that exact feeling.
If it's new to the situation and it actually works, you have produced a creative artifact.
And despite those end products looking wildly different, a repaired engine, a poem, a compliant toddler, the biological machinery that fired in the brain to produce them is identical.
Identical. In every single case, the brain took disparate, previously unlinked concepts and fused them together in a way that satisfied a goal.
Which begs the ultimate question. If this isn't magic and it isn't a random lightning strike, what is the actual sequence?
Right, what are the steps?
Yeah. If I want to map out the life cycle of an idea from the exact moment a problem is encountered to the moment the solution arrives, what are the literal steps?
So, to find the most accurate map, we actually have to look backward by exactly 1 century.
100 years.
100 years. In 1926, a social psychologist and educationalist named Graham Wallas published a book called The Art of Thought.
Okay.
And in it, he proposed a 4-stage model of creative cognition. What is so astonishing about this is that Wallas didn't have brain imaging.
No fMRI, no EEG?
Nothing. He just had meticulous observational data of human behavior.
Oh.
Yet his century-old framework perfectly aligns with modern neurological data.
That's incredible.
It remains the absolute gold standard in psychology today.
All right, so the first stage in Wallas's framework, this is what completely upended my understanding of this entire topic when I was reading through the sources. Stage 1 is preparation.
Yes, preparation.
And the literature makes it painfully clear that almost everyone drastically underestimates what this stage actually entails.
Because it is deeply, deeply unglamorous.
It really is.
Preparation is the period of intense, conscious, and often very frustrating engagement with a problem.
It's the phase where you are actively gathering data, mapping the boundaries of the domain, reading the literature.
Running failed experiments, hitting dead ends.
Yeah.
You are deliberately saturating your cognitive networks with the raw materials of the issue.
You're defining the parameters of what you don't know.
Exactly.
I found myself thinking about this in terms of culinary arts. Like, preparation is the equivalent of meticulously stocking your pantry and prepping your ingredients.
That's a great analogy.
You cannot walk into an empty kitchen, wait for inspiration to strike, and miraculously whip up a complex Michelin star dish.
Right, because there's nothing to cook with.
Exactly. If you only have a stale box of cereal and a bottle of hot sauce, your combinatorial possibilities are basically zero.
Unless you're in college.
Fair point, fair point.
Yeah.
But in general, you have to go to the market, you have to chop the vegetables. The lightning bolt of insight cannot strike an empty pantry.
It's a very apt metaphor. And to ground this in a massive historical reality, consider Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection.
This is such a good example.
When Darwin finally published On the Origin of Species in 1859 to the Victorian public, it felt like this sudden, cataclysmic intellectual explosion.
Like an overnight disruption of biology.
Exactly. But Darwin's preparation phase was almost pathologically thorough.
He wasn't just sitting on a beach in the Galapagos waiting for an epiphany.
Yeah,
Right.
not even close. I mean, yes, he spent 5 grueling years on the HMS Beagle collecting thousands of specimens.
Which is a lot of work in itself.
But even after he returned, he didn't just suddenly have the idea. He spent 8 straight years, from 1846 to 1854, exclusively studying barnacles.
8 years on barnacles.
Just classifying thousands of them, dissecting their microscopic reproductive organs, meticulously documenting the tiny, almost imperceptible variations between species.
That sounds agonizing.
And he corresponded with botanists and geologists globally. He read Thomas Malthus's dense economic theories on human population growth and resource scarcity.
He was just forcefully packing his pantry.
Yes. He spent literal decades forcefully packing it with an overwhelming volume of structural data regarding biological variation and environmental pressure.
And only with that massive conscious preparation could his brain eventually make the subconscious leap to natural selection.
Precisely.
But here is the paradox of stage 1. All of that conscious preparation, all of that agonizing over the problem, rarely yields the final answer directly.
No, it almost never does.
Darwin didn't figure out natural selection while literally staring through his microscope at a barnacle. Which brings us to the absolute necessity of stage 2, incubation.
Incubation is the cognitive pivot.
And it's so hard to do.
It is the phase where you consciously abandon the problem. You just stop banging your head against the wall.
You step away from the desk, you go for a walk, you take a shower, you go to sleep.
You redirect your executive attention entirely.
And I think this is where so many of us in modern knowledge-based economies fail completely.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because we were conditioned by this culture of constant hustle. Like, if I am stuck on a complex strategy document and I just stand up, walk away, and go look at a tree for 45 minutes, I am consumed by guilt.
Right, you feel like you're slacking off.
Wasting time, abandoning my responsibilities, all of it.
But the cognitive science insists that this guilt is entirely misplaced. Taking that break isn't an abandonment of the work. It is a critical continuation of the work via a different neural pathway.
That is so freeing to hear.
When you consciously set the problem aside, your brain does not delete the data you gathered during preparation. Instead, it hands the problem down to your unconscious processing systems.
Which work completely differently.
Right. These systems are not constrained by the rigid linear logic of your conscious mind. They begin to run simulations in the background, testing unusual combinations, shuffling the deck, and seeing if any of the weird associations form a stable pattern.
It's like sending the problem down to the night shift.
Exactly.
You turn the lights off upstairs, but the factory floor in the basement is running at full capacity. And the empirical evidence for this is undeniable, isn't it?
Absolutely. Studies consistently show that if you give 2 groups of subjects a complex puzzle, the group that is forced to take a completely unrelated break to incubate solves the puzzle at significantly higher rates.
Compared to the group that just grinds away at it continuously.
Right, because the conscious mind gets locked into a rigid pathway, a rut. Incubation forces you out of that rut.
Which perfectly sets the stage for what everyone is waiting for. Stage 3, illumination.
The famous aha moment.
The shower thought. But earlier, we talked about that 300 millisecond delay. I really want to dig into the literal biology of this.
Let's do it.
What exactly is happening in the physical meat of the brain when the night shift finally finds the answer?
To understand the mechanism, we really have to look at the division of labor in the brain, particularly between the left and right hemispheres.
Right, because for decades, pop psychology grossly oversimplified this.
Oh, completely. The whole left brain is logical, right brain is creative trope.
It's on every motivational poster.
But the reality is much more nuanced and fascinating.
Let's correct the record then. How does the brain actually handle associations?
So when you encounter a concept, say the word foot, your left hemisphere immediately activates closely related, highly predictable semantic associations.
Like shoe, toe, walk.
Exactly. It thinks shoe, toe, walk. It is efficient, literal, and highly focused. It keeps you grounded in immediate reality.
Okay, makes sense.
But simultaneously, your right hemisphere is doing something much stranger. It activates broad, distant, weakly related associations. For the word foot, the right hemisphere might dimly activate roller, mountain, or bill.
Oh, like the foot of a mountain.
Yeah.
While footing a bill, it casts a much wider, looser net.
Precisely. Now, during the incubation phase, as you are walking or sleeping, your left hemisphere's rigid grip on the problem relaxes.
It backs off.
Right. And the right hemisphere is quietly humming away, casting these wide nets looking for overlapping concepts. And when it finally detects a strong connection between two distant concepts that actually satisfies the parameters of the problem you set during preparation, that is when the biological event occurs.
The gamma burst.
Exactly. Deep in the right hemisphere, specifically in a region called the anterior temporal lobe, there is a sudden, explosive spike of high-frequency electrical activity.
It's a literal burst of energy.
A gamma burst. This region acts as a massive semantic hub, and it is firing to signal that a distant, non-obvious connection has been successfully forged.
And this is the burst that happens 300 milliseconds before you are consciously aware of it.
Yes. It takes a third of a second for that electrical signal to travel from the right anterior temporal lobe up into your conscious awareness, at which point you experience the feeling of illumination.
You gasp. You say, I've got it.
Exactly.
I just find that sequence so incredibly elegant. But the reality is not every idea that arrives with a gamma burst is actually a good idea.
Not at all.
I mean, I have jumped out of the shower with what I thought was a multi-million-dollar concept, furiously written it down, and then looked at it an hour later, only to realize it violates the basic laws of physics or economics. It's just total garbage.
We've all been there. And that is exactly why Wallace didn't stop at stage 3. Stage 4 is verification.
Because the unconscious mind is brilliant at finding remote connections, but it is terrible at logistics.
Terrible. Illumination only ever provides a candidate solution.
Right.
It comes with a massive hit of dopamine, which makes it feel undeniably true and profound in the moment, but it must survive the harsh light of conscious scrutiny.
The idea has to pay rent.
Right. Verification is where you bring the strict, analytical, logical mind back online. You have to ask the ruthless questions.
Does this business model actually scale?
Will this new material withstand the required thermal load? Does the climax of the screenplay actually resolve the protagonist's arc?
And verification is often just as laborious as preparation.
Sometimes even more so. And if the idea fails the verification stage, which it often does, you don't just quit.
What do?
You realize what part of the idea failed, you use that new constraint, and you feed it right back into stage 1. Preparation?
You gather new data, you incubate again.
It is a highly cyclical, iterative engine.
Okay, this cycle makes total logical sense from a bird's eye view. But I struggle to reconcile this with the physical reality of a modern workday.
How so?
Well, if the aha moment, that magical gamma burst from the right anterior temporal lobe happens when we're taking a break, what is actually shifting in the brain's networks to allow that? Because when I'm at my desk trying to force an answer, I feel a very specific type of mental strain.
Like hitting a brick wall.
Exactly. I am actively trying to be creative, and it hurts.
That feeling of strain is the hallmark of the brain's executive control network operating at maximum capacity.
Okay, the executive control network.
Yes. This network, centered heavily in the prefrontal cortex, is your brain's taskmaster. It is deliberate, focused, highly analytical, and heavily relies on the left hemisphere's tight associations.
So if I'm doing my taxes or editing a legal contract or optimizing a supply chain spreadsheet, my executive control network is lighting up.
It's the part of the brain that wears a suit and tie, carries a clipboard, and demands efficiency.
I love that, the guy with the clipboard.
It's an excellent way to conceptualize it, but for a long time, cognitive scientists assumed that because creative problem-solving is a hard mental task, it must also rely primarily on this suit-and-tie executive network.
Because it feels like hard work.
Right. Brain imaging, however, revealed a massive plot twist.
Oh, I love a plot twist.
When people are actively generating genuinely novel creative insights, the executive control network actually steps back.
It powers down.
Yes. The network that dominates during the generation of creative ideas is something called the default mode network, or the DMN.
The default mode network. Let's unpack this, because honestly, it sounds like the brain's screensaver.
Yeah.
What does it actually do?
Well, the screensaver analogy is historically accurate to how scientists first view it.
Really?
Yeah. Early neuroimaging studies noticed that when subjects were placed in a scanner and told to just stare at a crosshair and do nothing, this specific, widely distributed network of brain regions flared to life.
They just assumed it was a resting baseline.
Exactly. But we now know the DMN is incredibly active and complex. When you are daydreaming, mind-wandering, recalling deep autobiographical memories, or simulating possible future scenarios, your DMN is running the show.
So when I'm staring out the window on a train, watching the trees blur past, completely zoned out, My DMN is highly active.
Yes. And crucially for our purposes, the DMN is the network responsible for sifting through your vast archives of memory and knowledge, making those weird, remote, distant associations that we associate with the right hemisphere.
It is the network that throws the bizarre combinations against the wall to see what sticks.
Exactly.
So, to stick with our character metaphors, if the executive control network is the guy in the suit with a clipboard who is the default mode network.
The DMN is the DJ down in the basement.
A DJ.
He has access to every single record, every memory, every piece of data you've ever absorbed, and he doesn't care about genre.
He's just mixing everything.
He is perfectly happy to mix a track about 19th century French history with a beat about modern cryptocurrency and a vocal sample of your third grade teacher. He is endlessly, chaotically combining things.
I absolutely love this. But if the DJ is constantly spinning these brilliant, bizarre tracks down in the basement, why don't I hear them all day long?
Good question.
Like, why don't I just have a constant stream of creative genius flowing into my conscious mind?
Because the guy in the suit, the executive control network, also acts as a heavily armed bouncer at the door of your consciousness.
The bouncer.
And the bouncer has a very strict mandate. Keep the thoughts linear, logical, safe, and relevant to the immediate task at hand.
So if I am trying to write a polite email to my boss, and the DJ in the basement sends up a bizarre, abstract metaphor involving a circus elephant.
The bouncer looks at it, says, absolutely not, that is inappropriate and weird, and rejects it before it ever reaches your conscious awareness.
The bouncer kills the idea before I even know I had it.
Precisely. The bouncer enforces cognitive inhibition, which, by the way, is entirely necessary for surviving daily life and acting socially appropriate.
Otherwise, we'd all just be blurting out nonsense all day.
Exactly. But to achieve stage 3 illumination, to get that truly novel insight, you have to temporarily lower your cognitive inhibition. You have to distract the bouncer.
You have to lower the quality filter so that the weird, highly original tracks the DJ is spinning can slip past the door and enter your conscious mind.
And this is the biological mechanism of incubation.
Oh, so when I walk away from the stressful strategy document and go take a warm shower, I am basically telling the bouncer, hey, we're off the clock. You can relax.
Yes. The executive control network powers down, the cognitive filter drops, and suddenly the DJ's weird combination slips through, resulting in the gamma burst.
That is amazing.
You have successfully engineered a state of transient hypofrontality, a temporary dampening of the prefrontal cortex.
Transient hypofrontality.
That's why our best, most unconventional ideas so frequently arrive when we are falling asleep, waking up, or engaging in monotonous, low-stakes physical activities like showering, washing dishes, or walking.
Because the bouncer is off duty.
Exactly.
This connects flawlessly to one of my absolute favorite pieces of historical trivia from our sources. Let's talk about Thomas Edison.
A classic case study.
Because Edison lived long before we had fMRI machines or terms like default mode network. But he intuitively understood the necessity of bypassing the bouncer.
He really did.
And he developed a completely eccentric method to do it, specifically targeting the hypnagogic state.
The hypnagogic state being that very brief, bizarre transitional window between wakefulness and sleep. The exact moment when waking logic dissolves, the bouncer walks away from the door, and the DJ is given total control of the sound system. Dreams start to form, but you aren't fully unconscious yet.
Right. And Edison knew that the ideas he had in this state were incredibly valuable, but he also knew the inherent danger. If you cross the threshold into actual deep sleep, you lose the memory of those thoughts entirely.
They just vanish.
So he had to figure out a way to surf the very edge of sleep without falling in.
And his solution was brutally effective.
It really was. The story goes that when Edison hit a roadblock on an invention, he would sit in his favorite armchair in his study. He would take 2 heavy steel balls, one in each hand, and let his arms rest over the sides of the chair.
Yep.
And directly on the wooden floor below his dangling hands, he placed metal pans.
You can see the mechanical logic of it immediately.
It's a biological booby trap. So Edison closes his eyes, he begins to drift. His executive control network powers down.
The bouncer leaves.
The hypnagogic state washes over him, and his default mode network starts throwing out wild, uninhibited associations about filaments and electrical currents. He is right on the edge. But the biological rule of sleep is that the moment you cross from stage 1 sleep into deeper unconsciousness, you experience muscle atonia.
Your skeletal muscles completely relax.
And the moment his hands relax,
The steel balls slip from his fingers.
they drop through the air, smash into the metal pans on the floor, and create an absolute racket. Edison jolts awake, his heart racing, his prefrontal cortex snapping back to attention.
The bouncer rushes back to the door.
Right. But because he was violently pulled back before he could fall deeply asleep, the bizarre, uninhibited thoughts of the DJ are still echoing in his conscious mind. He immediately grabs a notebook and sketches them out before the bouncer can fully reestablish order and wipe the slate clean.
He literally engineered a physical mechanism to harvest the output of his default mode network.
It is a stunningly literal illustration of cognitive capture. He was forcefully holding the door open.
And, to be clear, modern researchers have actually replicated this.
Really? With the steel ball?
Well, a recent study at the Paris Brain Institute used a very similar method with subjects holding a plastic bottle. The subjects who reached the hypnagogic state and were immediately awakened were significantly more likely to discover a hidden mathematical shortcut in a puzzle they were given than those who stayed awake or those who fell into deep sleep.
Wow. So the sweet spot of creativity exists precisely in that borderland of lowered inhibition.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, this is undeniably fascinating, but to you, the learner, I know what you were probably thinking. I work in an open plan office. I cannot bring heavy steel balls and metal baking pans to my desk and terrify my coworkers every time I need a good idea.
Probably HR would have something to say about that.
Yeah, quick trip to HR. So how do we translate this extreme biology into waking practical cognitive strategies? How do we practice lowering the filter and exploring the search space without taking a nap?
To do that deliberately in a waking state, cognitive psychologists utilize a framework that splits creative thinking into two distinct alternating modes: divergent thinking and convergent thinking.
Okay.
Understanding how to manually shift between these two gears is the essence of practical creativity.
Let's start with divergent thinking. I want to play the guinea pig here because I think feeling the cognitive friction of these exercises is highly illustrative. What is divergent thinking?
Divergent thinking is the active, deliberate generation of multiple, highly varied, and unconventional responses to a single, open-ended prompt.
It's expanding outward.
Exactly. It forces your brain to abandon the primary obvious association and aggressively search for distant ones. The classic assessment for this was developed by J.P. Guilford in the 1960s. It's called the alternative uses task, but colloquially, it's known as the brick test.
All right, put me on the clock. Give me the test.
A prompt is simple. You have a standard red clay building brick. How many different uses can you think of for this brick?
Okay, starting with the immediate, obvious uses. You can build a wall. You can use it as a doorstop. You can use it as a paperweight on a windy day. You can use it to prop up a broken couch leg.
Stop right there and analyze what your brain just did. Every single one of those answers relies on the primary physical affordances of a brick. It is heavy and it is rigid.
Right.
Your executive control network is firmly in charge, providing safe, logical answers based on weight. You haven't diverged yet. You need to push past the physical obviousness.
Yeah.
Get weird.
Okay, abandoning weight and rigidity.
Mm.
I could crush the brick into a fine red dust and use it as a pigment to mix with oil paint.
Good.
I could hollow out the center of it, fill it with soil, and use it as a tiny brutalist planter for a succulent. I could heat it up in a fire, wrap it in a thick wool blanket, and put it at the foot of my bed to keep my feet warm. I could carve runes into it and try to sell it to tourists as an ancient mystical artifact.
There it is. That internal shift you just felt, the slight mental strain of forcing yourself away from the obvious, that is the activation of divergent thought.
It actually does feel like a strain.
When researchers score the brick test, they don't just look for fluency, which is the total number of ideas. They score for originality, how rare the idea is statistically. And crucially, they score for flexibility, which is how many different categories of use you generated.
Categories.
Shifting from building material to art supply to thermal battery demonstrates high cognitive flexibility. You are forcing the DJ to pull from totally different genres of knowledge.
It feels playful, but it also feels slightly exhaustive to maintain. So that is divergent thinking expanding outward. Our sources contrast this heavily with convergent thinking. How does the gear shift work?
If divergent thinking is an explosion outward, generating a massive, messy cloud of possibilities, convergent thinking is the intense gravitational contraction inward.
Contraction inward.
It is the process of synthesizing data to find the single, most accurate, most elegant answer to a highly constrained, well-defined problem. It is about precision and evaluation.
And there's a specific cognitive test for this as well, right?
Yes, the remote associates test, developed by Sarnoff-Mednick, This test doesn't ask for a million uses. It asks for one exact semantic bridge. I will give you three seemingly unrelated words. Your job is to find the single specific word that can be combined with all three to form a familiar compound word or phrase.
Let's do it. And to the learner, I challenge you to beat me to the answer.
The three words are pine, crab, sauce.
Pine, crab, sauce. Okay, instantly my brain goes to tree because of pine. Pine tree, crab tree, sauce tree. No, that's nonsense. Okay, what about ocean? Pine ocean? No. My brain is literally testing associations and hitting a wall. Wait, crab at apple, pineapple, apple sauce. The word is apple.
Correct.
Wow, that felt totally different.
Notice how completely different that felt from the brick test. You weren't throwing out wild, uninhibited guesses just to see what happened. You were holding three distinct constraints in your working memory and rapidly scanning your semantic networks for the one key that fit all three locks simultaneously.
It felt like a much sharper, narrower beam of focus. The bouncer was highly active, evaluating every word my brain suggested and instantly rejecting tree because it didn't fit sauce.
Exactly. And the central thesis of creative problem solving is that you absolutely unconditionally need both modes. They are the two legs of walking.
You can't just have one.
If you only possess divergent thinking, you will generate a million bizarre ideas, but you will lack the analytical rigor to evaluate which ones are actually viable, useful, or safe. You will just have a room full of crushed brick pigment and ruined couches.
Pure novelty without utility.
Precisely. But if you only possess convergent thinking, you will be a brilliant analytical evaluator, but you will have absolutely no original ideas to evaluate. You will spend your life brilliantly optimizing the status quo, trapped within the existing paradigm.
So what's the goal?
The hallmark of a true innovator is cognitive flexibility, the disciplined ability to shift into divergent mode during the incubation and early illumination phases to cast the wide net, and then seamlessly shift into convergent mode during the verification phase to ruthlessly evaluate and refine the catch.
Okay, this brings up a massive paradox that I really want to dissect. If I am the learner listening to this and I want to maximize my divergent thinking, I want to come up with a brilliantly unique idea for a novel or a marketing campaign or a software architecture, the logical assumption is that I should seek total freedom.
That's what we're told, right?
Yeah, I should want a completely blank canvas, no rules, no budget limits, and an infinite horizon so my brain can go anywhere. But the sources reveal that this assumption is completely disastrously backward.
It is the single most counterintuitive reality of creative work. Absolute freedom is the enemy of innovation. If you want to force the brain to generate genuinely novel ideas, you do not remove limits. You aggressively impose constraints.
The paradox of constraints. I find this endlessly fascinating. Why does the blank canvas paralyze us?
It comes down to how the brain navigates what computer scientists call the search space. If I give you a problem and tell you there are 0 rules, the possible solution space is effectively infinite.
And infinity is scary.
Human neurology does not process infinity well. It demands massive metabolic energy to evaluate endless options. When faced with an infinite search space, the brain usually panics.
So what does it do?
It either experiences complete paralysis, the terror of the blank page, writer's block, or, more commonly, it seeks safety by immediately retreating to the most generic, deeply worn, highly conventional pathways just to have something familiar to hold on to.
We just grab the first cliche that comes to mind because the void is too terrifying.
Exactly. But when you introduce a severe constraint, you fundamentally alter the geometry of the search space. You bound the infinity, you build a box.
You build a box.
By making the obvious, easy, conventional solutions impossible, you forcefully evict the brain from its comfortable rut. You force the DMN to explore the dark, dusty, non-obvious corners of your semantic network.
When you look at the history of art, this principle is everywhere. Take the Shakespearean sonnet.
Perfect example.
It is, by definition, a linguistic prison. You are granted exactly 14 lines. You must operate within a rigid, rhythmic meter-iambic pentameter. You are locked into an unforgiving rhyme scheme. From a modern perspective of creative freedom, that sounds like a miserable cage.
It sounds awful.
And yet, that exact crushing constraint forced writers to produce some of the most haunting, inventive, and emotionally resonant English ever put to paper. They couldn't just use the first, most accurate word that came to mind. They had to dig deep into their lexicon to find the only word that possessed the correct meaning, the correct syllable count, and the correct rhyme. The friction created the fire.
We see this principle engineered into almost every creative discipline. The Japanese haiku restricts the poet to 17 syllables. In the tech world, the original 140-character limit of Twitter birthed an entirely new, culturally dominant form of condensed, punchy communication.
Or the elevator pitch.
Yes. The constraint of explaining a highly complex, multi-million-dollar startup architecture in exactly 30 seconds forces founders to achieve an agonizing level of creative clarity.
There is a specific psychological study mentioned in our research that perfectly quantifies this. The Hot Tromp study out of the University of Edinburgh. It's a brilliant piece of experimental design.
Catrinal Hot Tromp's research provides the empirical proof for the sonnet effect. She divided a group of writers into two cohorts. The first cohort was given the blank canvas treatment. They were simply told to write a creative, original sentence. Total freedom.
And what happened?
They produced largely generic, forgettable, deeply conventional sentences. The infinite search space led to mediocrity.
Classic panic.
But the second cohort was given a set of bizarre, highly specific constraints. They were instructed that they must write a single sentence that successfully conveyed both a sad emotion and a funny emotion simultaneously, and the sentence must organically incorporate the specific nouns mother and umbrella.
That is an incredibly tight linguistic box. Just trying to do that on the fly. My mother left her umbrella at the funeral, which is sad for her, but funny for the guy standing next to her. No, that's disjointed. It's really hard.
It forces your brain to treat the sentence like a complex jigsaw puzzle.
And that cognitive strain is the point. When independent judges blindly rated the sentences from both groups, the results were unequivocal. The sentences produced by the heavily constrained group were rated as significantly more inventive, more emotionally resonant, and far more creative than the group with total freedom.
The constraint forced the writers to abandon the obvious tropes and find highly unusual narrative angles to make the puzzle pieces fit.
So, to the learner listening right now, the actionable takeaway here is profound. Stop staring at the void. If you are stuck on a project, actively build yourself a smaller box.
Give yourself some rules.
If you need to write a proposal to a client, don't just give yourself the vague task. Write a good proposal. Introduce an artificial constraint. Tell yourself, I must write this proposal in under 300 words, using only active verbs, and I cannot use the words synergy or optimization. Watch how your brain instantly stops panicking about the blank page and starts aggressively trying to beat the rules of the game.
It is cognitive scaffolding. Constraints give the brain something to push against. However, we must address the other side of this equation. Constraints define the shape of the box, but what you actually fill the box with.
Right. A beautifully constructed constraint is useless if your cognitive pantry is empty.
The constraint forces the brain to search for remote associations, but if you don't possess the knowledge in the first place, there's nothing to associate. Which brings us to the sobering reality of what it actually takes to be creative on a world-class level. The absolute necessity of deep, ruling knowledge acquisition.
And here we must dismantle another pervasive myth, the archetype of the natural genius.
The chosen one.
The romantic idea that a brilliant, untrained novice can simply walk into a complex field, whether it's physics, chess, or jazz, and effortlessly revolutionize it overnight based purely on raw intuition. The historical and cognitive data show that this basically never happens.
Never. True, paradigm-shifting creative breakthroughs are almost universally built on a massive subterranean foundation of accumulated expertise.
Our sources delve into the famous 10-year rule. Let's break down the science of expertise because it fundamentally validates Wallace's stage 1 of preparation.
The 10-year rule was pioneered by researchers like Herbert Simon and William Chase, and heavily expanded upon by K. Anders Ericsson. They studied world-class performers across highly disparate domains. Grandmaster chess players, elite classical composers, groundbreaking theoretical physicists.
And what did they find?
They found a remarkably consistent chronological pattern. To produce a genuine domain-altering creative contribution, an individual typically requires a minimum of 10 years of intensive, deliberate practice within that specific field.
A full decade of just stocking the pantry.
Exactly, and deliberate practice is key here. It's not just passively doing a job for 10 years. It is 10 years of aggressively pushing the boundaries of your competence, failing, analyzing the failure, and restructuring your mental models.
What's happening in the brain over that time?
What happens neurologically over a decade is a process called chunking. A novice looking at a chessboard sees 32 individual, overwhelming pieces. But after 10 years, a grandmaster's brain has physically rewired to recognize complex structural patterns or chunks. They don't see 32 pieces, they see 4 or 5 interacting dynamic zones.
That's a huge shift in perception.
This highly efficient neural chunking frees up massive amounts of working memory, allowing the grandmaster to intuitively sense creative, unconventional moves that the novice cannot even perceive.
So the lightning bolt of insight does not strike the uninformed.
Never. The lightning bolt is simply the sudden connection of two highly complex chunks of knowledge that took a decade to build.
But inevitably, whenever this is brought up, people immediately point to history's famous prodigies as counter-evidence. They say, what about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? He was writing concertos when he was a toddler. What about Einstein?
It is the standard rebuttal, but when cognitive historians actually analyze the timelines of those prodigies, the 10-year rule is entirely vindicated.
Let's look at Mozart.
It is absolutely true that he was performing and composing at age 6, driven largely by his father, Leopold, who was a demanding pedagogue. But musicologists who analyze those early childhood compositions will tell you that they are not creatively groundbreaking.
Really?
They are highly skilled, extremely clever imitations and pastiches of existing composers like Johann Christian Bach. They are the work of a brilliant sponge absorbing the rules of the domain. Mozart's genuinely immortal, historically disruptive, truly creative masterpieces did not begin to emerge until his early 20s.
Which means he had been practicing deliberately for roughly 10 to 15 years.
Exactly, the timeline holds. Look at Albert Einstein. He published his 4 Annus Mirabilis papers, including the special theory of relativity in 1905 when he was just 26 years old.
It looked like a sudden explosion of youthful genius.
But Einstein had been obsessively, intensively studying advanced physics, Maxwell's equations, and complex mathematics since he was a young teenager. He had put in his decade of agonizing preparation.
The same applies to Pablo Picasso, right?
Oh, definitely. The public looks at a Cubist masterpiece like Guernica and assumes he just wildly threw abstract shapes on a canvas. But Picasso spent his entire childhood and adolescence rigorously mastering classical, hyper-realistic, academic painting. He could paint like a Renaissance master by age 15.
He had to learn the rules before he could break them.
He had to spend a decade learning exactly how the rules of perspective, light, and anatomy functioned before his brain possessed the deep structural knowledge required to creatively shatter them.
Okay, I have a major pushback here, a very real philosophical tension. If you spend 10 straight years ruthlessly studying one specific domain, reading all the established textbooks, absorbing the orthodoxy of the field, and learning how everyone else has always solved the problem, doesn't that inherently make you cognitively rigid?
That is the big risk.
Doesn't knowing too much risk turning you into an entrenched institutionalist who only sees the world through the established paradigm? In Zen Buddhism, there's the famous concept of Shoshin, the beginner's mind. The idea that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few. Doesn't the 10-year rule destroy the beginner's mind?
That is a brilliant pushback, and you have hit upon the central vulnerability of deep expertise. Cognitive psychologists call this entrenchment or the Einstellung effect.
The Einstellung effect.
Yeah. When you become an absolute expert in a field, your brain becomes so brutally efficient at recognizing familiar patterns that it will automatically force a new problem into an old framework. You become literally blind to alternative, simpler, or more radical solutions because your neural pathways are paved too deeply.
You can't see the forest for the trees.
The beginner's mind is incredibly valuable because the novice asks the supposedly stupid fundamental questions that the experts are too embarrassed or too entrenched to ask. And sometimes those naive questions reveal a fatal rot at the foundation of the entire discipline.
So we have an unsolvable contradiction. We absolutely need the 10 years of grueling expertise to possess the complex neural chunks required to formulate a breakthrough. But we simultaneously need the unburdened, naive perspective of the beginner's mind to avoid being blinded by our own expertise. How on earth do we reconcile that?
We reconcile it through the ultimate archetype of human innovation, the cross-domain synthesizer.
Oh, this is the holy grail. Break this down.
A cross-domain thinker is an individual who pays the toll. They acquire deep, 10-year level expertise in one specific rigorous field. They build the complex mental models, but then rather than staying in that field and becoming entrenched, they physically or intellectually transport themselves into a completely different field.
They switch gears entirely.
When they cross the border, they possess a cognitive superpower. They simultaneously hold both contradictory requirements. In their original field, they have deep, complex knowledge. In their new field, they have the fresh, unburdened perspective of an absolute beginner.
They are an expert and an alien at the same time.
Precisely. Imagine a deeply trained evolutionary biologist who spends a decade understanding natural selection, genetic mutation, environmental pressure, and speciation. Then they decide to take a fellowship in an economics department studying the life cycle of tech startups in Silicon Valley.
Okay.
They bring their deeply entrenched biological mental models and apply them to how corporations compete, mutate, and die in a free market. To the traditional economists who have been entrenched in financial theory for decades, the biologists' ideas seem radically novel, bizarre, and wildly creative.
But to the biologists, they're just applying basic familiar tools in a brand new sandbox.
Exactly.
They are cross-pollinating the search space. It's like a historian who takes a job at a major social media company, applying historical models of societal collapse to predict user behavior and radicalization on the platform. Or a trained classical architect who decides to design video game environments.
Yeah.
You have the heavy lifting of a 10-year rule, but you retain the beginner's mind because you are playing someone else's game.
And if you look at the history of Nobel Prizes or major technological leaps, they almost never originate from the dead center of an established discipline. They almost always erupt from the intersections, from the friction generated when the mental models of one domain violently collide with the problems of another.
All right, let's zoom out and look at the physical reality of all this. We have explored the internal psychological process, Wallace's 4 stages. We've explored the neurobiology, the DJ in the default mode network, and the bouncer in the prefrontal cortex. We understand the necessity of severe constraints and the paradox of cross-domain expertise. But none of this cognitive fireworks display happens in a vacuum. We possess these brains inside physical bodies, existing in physical spaces and social hierarchies. If the learner wants to optimize for all of this, what is the ideal external environment? Let's talk about architecting the space for creativity. The environment acts as a massive modifier to everything we've discussed. And the most critical environmental factor is not physical, it is social. It is the concept of psychological safety.
Which translates to, am I going to be mocked if I say this out loud?
Exactly. Remember the bouncer at the door of your consciousness. The executive control network is highly sensitive to social threat. Evolutionarily, being ostracized from the tribe meant death.
So the stakes feel incredibly high to the brain. If you are in an environment, a corporate boardroom, a university seminar, or even a family dinner, where the social costs of suggesting an unusual, divergent idea is ridicule, demotion, or rolling eyes, your brain will proactively shut down the default mode network. Fear puts the bouncer on high alert.
I have visceral memories of this, the classic bad brainstorm meeting. A manager says, there are no bad ideas, but the moment someone suggests something genuinely weird, the manager scoffs or immediately points out why it won't work. The psychological safety evaporates instantly. You can actually feel the temperature of the room drop and your brain just freezes. You retreat to the safest, most boring, highly convergent ideas possible, just to survive the hour without looking stupid.
It is the death of divergent thought. A genuinely innovative organization or partnership is one that structurally and culturally guarantees that the incubation and divergent ideation phases are protected from premature verification. You have to separate the generation of ideas from the evaluation of ideas. Psychological safety is the prerequisite for the bouncer to lower his guard.
Assuming you have psychological safety, what about the actual physical acoustics of the room? Because there is a massive cultural cliche of the aspiring screenwriter or startup founder dragging their laptop to a bustling, crowded coffee shop. Is there actual cognitive science backing up the coffee shop effect? Or is it just people wanting to look cool while drinking expensive lattes?
It is backed by highly specific, robust acoustical science. Researchers, led by Ravi Mehta, investigated how different levels of ambient background noise affect creative cognition. They tested subjects in absolute silence, around 50 decibels, moderate noise, 70 decibels, and high noise, 85 decibels, which is like a loud blender.
Okay, so 3 distinct sound environments.
They found a very specific, undeniable Goldilocks zone for creative ideation, exactly 70 decibels of ambient noise.
And 70 decibels sounds like what, practically?
It is the exact acoustic signature of a busy coffee shop. The clinking of ceramic cups, the hiss of the espresso steam wand, the low, unintelligible murmur of overlapping conversations.
But logically, that makes no sense. If I am trying to do hard mental work, shouldn't I want absolute dead silence in a library so I can focus perfectly?
Well, if you are doing convergent work, if you are balancing a ledger, doing your taxes, or proofreading a legal brief, yes, you want absolute silence. You need your executive control network to have zero distractions.
but for divergent work.
Right. Remember, for divergent ideation, we want to slightly impair the executive control network. We want to distract the bouncer. Absolute silence allows the bouncer to focus completely on suppressing weird thoughts. But 70 decibels of ambient, unpredictable noise provides just enough cognitive load to slightly overwhelm the prefrontal cortex. It occupies the bouncer's attention, which allows your associative mind, the DJ in the basement, to slip more unusual ideas past the door.
It's a literal acoustic hack. It's loud enough to disrupt rigid linear thinking, but not so loud that you can't hold a thought in your working memory.
Exactly. It forces processing disfluency, which triggers abstract thinking. Now, if you push it to 85 decibels, the cognitive load becomes too great and you just get stressed and distracted. But 70 decibels is the sweet spot for incubation.
What about leaving the built environment entirely? We talked about taking walks during the incubation phase, but does the location of the walk matter? If I walk through downtown Manhattan versus walking through a forest, does my brain react differently?
It matters immensely, and it comes down to a framework called attention restoration theory, developed by environmental psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. They distinguish between two fundamentally different types of human attention. The first is directed attention. This is the top-down, effortful, heavily filtered focus you use when you are staring at a spreadsheet, listening to a complex lecture, or navigating a busy, dangerous city intersection.
It requires willpower, and it is exhausting.
It is highly metabolically expensive. The reservoir of directed attention depletes rapidly, resulting in cognitive fatigue. The second type of attention is involuntary attention, or what the Kaplans call soft fascination.
Soft fascination.
This is the bottom-up, effortless attention that is engaged when you are immersed in natural, fractal environments. Watching the flames of a campfire, looking at the pattern of ripples on a pond, or walking through a dense canopy of trees.
Nature doesn't aggressively demand your attention, it gently invites it.
Beautifully put. And what decades of research show is that engaging in soft fascination in natural environments actively and rapidly restores your depleted reserves of directed attention. But more importantly for our topic, navigating a forest does not require the heavy filtering of the prefrontal cortex. It creates the perfect, low-demand, safe physiological state for the default mode network to power up.
Because you aren't dodging traffic.
When you walk in a concrete urban grid, you have to constantly monitor for cars, crosswalks, and strangers. Your executive network must stay active to keep you alive. When you walk in a forest, the bouncer can truly go to sleep, and the unconscious mind can safely incubate the massive data you gathered during preparation.
I want to address one final environmental factor, which is actually a biological necessity that our culture treats as a luxury: sleep. Because there is a deeply toxic mythology in the creative and corporate worlds that equates sleep deprivation with dedication. The tortured artist staying up for 3 days straight. The founder bragging about pulling back-to-back all-nighters to ship a product.
It is one of the most self-destructive mythologies in modern business. We have already established how vital REM sleep, the dreaming phase, is for the incubation stage. REM sleep is the ultimate biological state of lowered associative constraints. But the other side of the coin is what sleep deprivation does to the waking brain. Chronic lack of sleep specifically, severely and disproportionately impairs the functioning of the prefrontal cortex.
It damages the suit and tie guy.
Devastatingly so. And remember Wallace's 4 stages. While we want to lower the bouncer's guard during incubation to allow illumination, we absolutely unconditionally rely on a highly functioning prefrontal cortex for verification.
You have to be able to test the idea.
If you are chronically sleep deprived, your default mode network might occasionally throw up a weird idea, but you will possess zero analytical firepower to actually evaluate it, refine it, and execute it into reality. You will be incapable of convergent thought. The person sacrificing sleep for the sake of their project is actively blunting the exact cognitive instrument they need to finish the job.
So we have optimized the acoustic environment with 70 decibels, we have restored our attention in the woods, and we are fiercely protecting our sleep. The external reality is set. But as we move toward the end of this deep dive, our sources point to one final, deeply personal environment that might dictate the success of this entire process more than anything else. And that is the internal environment, the story you tell about who you are. Let's talk about the concept of the creative self.
This is perhaps the most empowering, practical finding in the entire body of literature we've discussed today. Research pioneered by psychologists like Carmit Tadmore has demonstrated a reality that sounds almost like magical thinking, but is rooted in hard behavioral science. Simply believing that you are a creative person, actively claiming that identity, actually causes you to produce measurably more creative work.
I have to admit, when I first read that, my skeptical alarm bells went off. It sounds like a generic self-help affirmation. Just look in the mirror and say you're creative, and you will be.
Yeah.
How does a belief physically alter cognitive output?
It alters output through a powerful behavioral feedback loop based on identity-driven friction tolerance.
Okay, unpack that.
Imagine two individuals, person A and person B. They possess the exact same baseline IQ, the exact same education, and the exact same working memory capacity. But person A has internalized the identity, I am a creative problem solver. Person B has internalized the identity, I am an analytical numbers person, I'm not the creative type. When both are faced with a highly ambiguous, difficult problem, their beliefs dictate their behavior.
How do they diverge in the moment of stress?
Creative work, specifically the incubation phase where you don't yet have the answer, is psychologically profoundly uncomfortable. It is a state of prolonged ambiguity. Person A, the one who identifies as creative, expects this discomfort. They view the ambiguity as a natural part of the process. They are willing to sit in the tension. They're persistent through the early failed iterations. And crucially, they're willing to take the social risk of voicing a weird, unpolished idea.
And person B?
Person B, who believes they are not creative, interprets the exact same ambiguity as a signal of failure. The moment the obvious answer doesn't work, their identity tells them, see, you aren't built for this. They prematurely abort the divergent search and immediately retreat to the safest, most conventional, convergent answer just to alleviate the discomfort of not knowing.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy via behavioral persistence. By claiming the label, you grant yourself the internal authorization to endure the messy, nonlinear actions that produce the result. I absolutely love that. And our sources apply this identity shift to a highly specific, universally frustrating task that many of our listeners might be struggling with right now, learning a second language as an adult.
Language acquisition is a perfect microcosm for this entire cognitive framework. Most adults approach learning a new language entirely through the lens of convergent thinking. They treat it as a robotic, mechanical task of pure rule memorization, vocabulary drilling, and rigid syntax application. They view the language as a math equation where there is only one correct answer.
Which makes speaking it terrifying, because if you treat it like an equation, every time you use the wrong verb tense, you have failed. The bouncer in your brain is constantly screaming, you conjugated that wrong, you sound stupid, stop speaking.
Exactly. The executive control network is paralyzing you with a demand for perfection. But the profound insight from the literature is to reframe language learning not as a mechanical task, but as a deeply creative act. Every time you attempt to speak in a foreign language, you are generating novel utterances. You are forced to make bizarre real-time associations to find a word that is close enough to convey your meaning. You are constantly engaged in divergent problem solving. If you don't know the word for bridge, you have to creatively combine road and over water to make yourself understood.
You have to embrace the messiness.
Yes. Most importantly, you must tolerate the friction of a bad accent and incorrect grammar to achieve the goal of communication. If you approach learning a language as an artist, as a creative explorer who expects to make weird associations and look a bit foolish rather than a robot demanding flawless execution, you drastically lower the cognitive filter. You bypass the bouncer. And studies show this identity shift changes the entire trajectory of how quickly and fluidly you actually absorb the new language.
Okay, let's step back and synthesize this entire journey for the learner. We started by tearing down a myth, and I think we have successfully replaced it with a much more powerful reality. Creativity is not a magic lightning bolt reserved for the chosen few. It is a rigorous, deeply human four-stage engine. It starts with preparation, a decade of deliberately stocking your cognitive pantry and building complex neural chunks. It demands incubation, the courage to step away, lower your filters, and let the DJ in your default mode network spin weird tracks. It results in illumination, that 300 millisecond gamma burst of a remote association. And it concludes with a verification bringing the bouncer back online to ensure the idea actually survives reality. We learned that to force this engine to work, we need strict, unforgiving constraints to bound our search space. We need the 70-decibel hum of a coffee shop or the soft fascination of a forest. And above all, we must fiercely claim the identity that we are capable of sitting in the uncomfortable ambiguity of the unknown.
That is the invisible architecture of insight.
But before we sign off, we always like to leave you, the learner, with a final provocative thought. something that builds upon everything we've explored today, but pushes the paradigm into entirely uncharted territory for you to mull over on your own time.
We have spent this entire deep dive mapping the neurobiology of the human brain, how we gather data over decades, and how we must trick our prefrontal cortex into lowering its guard so our default mode network can find the bizarre, remote associations that lead to breakthroughs. But consider the technological moment we are living in right now. What happens to this entire 100-year-old framework when we introduce artificial intelligence? What if the true power of large language models is not to generate the final, polished, convergent answers for us, but to act as a massive, chaotic, externalized default mode network? What if we use AI to deliberately supply us with the strange, highly improbable semantic associations and vast cross-domain data points that we could never accumulate in a single, limited human lifetime? And then we humans focus our energy entirely on the verification stage, using our executive function and lived experience to evaluate, refine, and humanize those distant dots.
It completely inverts the process. The machine becomes the dreamer in the basement, and the human becomes the bouncer at the door, deciding which wild ideas get to enter reality. That is a staggering frontier to consider. To the learner, thank you so deeply for joining us on this deep dive. Now take this knowledge, close your laptop, put your phone in another room, go take a long, quiet walk in the woods, let your bouncer clock out for the day, and see what dots connect.